Hi, my name's Simon Bennett. I'm the ZAP founder and project lead, and I'm giving a series of training sessions on ZAP to the folks here at Stack.org. I'm doing it live, so some people may ask questions, but if you're watching this after the event, please just ask any questions you've got in the comments section below. So this is the previous session recorded was on active scanning, and what I want to do is I want to get on to automation fairly soon. But while kind of thinking about that, I realized that what I ought to tell you about before going to automation is configuration. And there's a good reason for that, or what I think is a good reason. And that's because with automation, we always recommend that the best way to set up ZAP is using the ZAP desktop, even if you want to automate ZAP later using daemon mode. So it's always best to use the desktop because you can actually see what's going on. So it's much easier, it's much quicker. You've got turnaround time of identifying and solving problems. But then you've got the problem of moving from the desktop to your automated settings. And for that, you often need to know where ZAP stores things, because you'll be setting things up on your desktop, and then you'll want to run ZAP maybe in a Docker container, maybe on a remote server. And if you don't know where ZAP's putting things, you won't know what to copy across and where things need to go. So this episode is going to be on configuration. And hopefully you can now see the ZAPproxy.org, because I'm going to be talking around various docs. But one of the first things I want to point out is ZAPCon. We are having a ZAP conference on March the 9th in 2021. So you're watching this sometime in the future. Sorry, you might have missed it. But if you're watching it not long after it's recorded, then please have a look at that. If you actually click on the image there, that will actually take you to the zapcon.io site, and you can register and you can submit a talk as well if you like. And so the CFP call for speakers closes on 19th of February. What I want to do now is talk about ZAP configuration. And one thing, we have various frequently asked questions about configuration. So if you can't remember this, and I must admit I often do this myself, actually go to the docs online. So documentation, frequently asked questions down at the bottom. So we have loads of facts here. But what I'll say first is there's a difference between, we've got two directories, one where you install ZAP and one what we call the default directory that ZAP uses. So you can see here we've got a fact, where is ZAP installed? And that will vary depending on the operating system you're using. So we've got the instructions there for Windows 7, XP, Linux, Mac OS. I mean, if you actually download the packages, the kind of tars or zips or whatever, you can install it wherever you like. But if you use another installers, then it's useful to know where these things are put. And then we've got this default directory. So the idea is that ZAP actually, we've got the installation directory, which you may well not actually have write access to. And then you've got the default directory, and that is where ZAP will store the configurations that are specific to you. So you can actually install ZAP so it can be run by different users on your machine, but the configuration directory is relative to your home directory. So you can see, again, we've got different directories depending on operating system. We're trying to be kind of nice and follow whatever the standards are. And what we'll see is that on Mac OS, it's under your library application support / ZAP directory in capitals. And have a notice down at the bottom that if you're using weekly releases or actually development builds, then _D is appended to that. So what I'm going to do is I've got this, I've got a command line, and we'll have a look at someone on a Mac. So application support, ZAP. And you'll see I've actually got two directories because I have both a standard ZAP install and, not surprisingly, a development version of ZAP. So I'm actually going to just use this. I'm going to use the standard one, and I'll just CD there to make things a little bit easier for me. And you can see we've got a whole load of files in there. Now, the way this works is add-ons can actually, so we've got some standard files that ZAP uses, the kind of ZAP core uses, but then add-ons can store whatever files they want in this, underneath this directory as well. And some add-ons actually include files that you aren't expected. It's best if you don't change. So those are typically packaged within the add-on jars. But if there could be a good reason for you wanting to change those files, or if we need to access them directly, then this is where they will get stored. So one file which I do want to point out, even though it's not to do with configuration really, is zap.log. So this is very important if you're having any sort of problems, because if you report anything to us, then one of the first things we'll do is probably say, have a look at zap.log. So this is where ZAP puts its log. This is the log information. So this is where any potential any errors will be logged. So that's very useful for us for support purposes. But then the other key one I want to point out is this config.xml. So this is an XML file, and what I'll do is I'll actually switch to ZAP now. So this is the ZAP desktop, which you've seen before, and what I've pointed out before is the options. So as you'll hopefully know, ZAP has loads and loads of options, and these options are pretty much all stored in that config.xml file. So we'll go down to the ZAP passive scanner, because that's actually the information you see first. So we'll see with config, then pscans, so passive scans, and you'll see things like scan only in scope. So if I just switch over here, we'll actually see, just move this out of the way. You can see that I don't have only scan messages in scope selected, and here we've got scan only in scope false. Then we've got include traffic from the fuzzer, and we've got scan fuzzer messages false. So the whole idea of this file is to store all of those user-specific configuration items. Obviously, we're kind of the names we're using they're fairly terse, but hopefully means understandable. We didn't really intend people to actually edit this file directly. We were assuming that people would always edit things via the options. But it turns out with automation, there are actually lots of reasons why you might want to set these things directly. And we've got a way, which I'll explain later, of actually setting these things directly. And for that, you do actually have to have a look at the file and see what values to put in there. And then we come down here, let's have a look. We've got some other things. We've got something to do with auto-removing auto tag scanners, and that is not actually in here. But if you actually have a look here, we've got several different screens which are associated with passive scan rules. And here you actually see there's passive scan tags removed without confirmation. And that is actually what that particular configuration item refers to. So be aware that there may well actually be several screens associated with any particular add-on, and therefore, it might not be immediately obvious what these things relate to. And then we'll see we've got this list of auto tag scanners. So here we've got the HTML tag form, and if we go in here, there'll be HTML tag form. If we have a look at that, then we'll see that it's looking for regex, starting with just form. And if we go back to the configuration file, there we've got the angle bracket and form. So this is where all of these things are actually configured. This is a file that is really useful to know about when you get into automation and if you want to actually set particular options. So I think we've got a how to find, how do you find what key to use when setting a config value from the command line. And that is because, let me have a look. We actually have a FAQ here for the command line options, which then takes us to the help. So this explains the command line options for ZAP. And what you'll see is we have various options we've got a couple of options for setting configuration parameters. So we've got one where -config, and then you give key equals value pairs, or one pair, but you can specify this as many times as you like. And then we've got another option for a config file, and this is where the file would have key equal values pairs, one per line. And we then have another frequently asked question, which is, how do you find out what key to use to set a config value? And this is where it really helps to understand this XML file, because what you can do is you can specify as many options as configuration options as you like, and they have this dot notation. And that is essentially the location of the configuration file in this config.xml file. So if we have a look at, here we've got scanners thread per host. So here we've got scanner thread per host. So if you want to set that, you specify -config scanner dot thread per host. And so that was the item from the configuration file, and that is how you specify it from the command line. And you can also specify arrays as well. So some of the configuration items, for example, the replacer has an array of values, and this is how you can set array values. And if you're actually doing it in the file, then you don't actually include the escaping as well. So this means you can set, if there's anything in the config.xml file, then you can specify it when you start ZAP from the command line. The one thing that's worth pointing out is that the code that sets these values doesn't actually look at the configuration file. So if, it changes it, but it isn't aware of all the possible values. So if you type one of these things incorrectly, then ZAP will quite happily set that value in the configuration file, but it won't do what you think it's going to do. So if you want to set values from the command line, then make sure you actually test them. Try them out, make sure that they are being set in the configuration file as you expect. So that kind of should be a very, that sounds like it's a very quick thing. Great, that's where everything lives. But there's actually quite a few files in here, and not everything that you can configure via the desktop ends up in the configuration file. And there's what we hope are good reasons for that. So let's go to the ZAP desktop. And one thing we've got here is contexts. So contexts define the application that you are testing at the moment, or parts of an application that you're testing at the moment. And the reason why this doesn't get stored in the configuration file is that we kind of expect that some people will be testing lots of different applications. And you might start ZAP testing one particular application, and then an hour later or a day later or a week later, you'll be testing another application. And you don't typically go back or a lot of people don't go back and test exactly the same applications all the time. Some people do, some people don't. But to have a whole, if we put everything in the configuration file, then we could end up with a huge number of contexts defined here. So what we have is these options to import and export contexts. So we have contexts as separate from your ZAP options. These options are the ones that you're tuning ZAP to work the way you want to, but then the contexts define the application you're testing at this particular moment. And so you can import contexts, the ones that you've defined before, and you can export them as well. And by default, they end up in this context directory. And not too surprisingly, if we go to this standard directory, you will see there's a context directory. And in my particular case, I've got the juice shop poll context. So we can actually have a look at that. And this is actually another XML file, and that defines everything to do with your the application, including things like the session handling, the authorization, how you're polling for authentication, the technology it uses, all of these things. So basically, if you go in here and edit this context or create a new one, the default context we won't store by default. So you will then, anything to do with the context, all of this information here gets put in first in the context you're using, but then if you save that, it will go into a file by default in the context directory, but of course you can change that. So the thing is, if you then, one of the common things you actually want to do is configure ZAP to work particularly well with the best way it can with your application, and nearly always you can define a context to do that, particularly with authentication. And that means when you move from the ZAP desktop to automation, you need to make sure that you save the context file you've created for your application, and then you need to import it when you're using ZAP in automation. So even though I've got this juice shop poll context defined, ZAP won't automatically open it because I could have hundreds in there. This means that when you're running ZAP in automation, you need to actually do essentially the same thing. You need to tell ZAP to load a particular context file. And if you're running ZAP in a container like Docker, you need to make sure that that file is available to ZAP. So that is context, and that is why they're in a separate file. So next thing is the policies. So we have scan policies, and you can see here I've got two policies, the default policy, and I've got one which is called SQLI only. And we're storing those things separately as well. So if we actually go back to the configuration and have a look at, not surprisingly, policies, you'll see I've got the default policy and the SQLI only policy. And the reason we store these separately is because we think these are things that are more likely to be shared. So yes, you could define a whole load of policies, but I suppose a bit like context, we expect them to be something that you reuse. And policies tend to be more generic. They're not specific to particular applications. So that's why you can have a whole list of policies here. And as you'll see, the policies get loaded automatically. So basically, anything in this policies directory will be loaded when ZAP starts. And so I'm just going to add a policy, and I'm going to call it demo test. And hopefully now, there we've got the demo test policy. Actually, have a look at that. And once again, it's an XML file. And you can see the name, then the scanner, and the plugins, and this is the configuration. And this means it is much easier to share these things if you've got a standard company policies, if you want to test particular applications in particular ways. And it also makes it easier in automation if you actually want to, again, define policies and test policies locally, and then import them when you're scanning, you're using ZAP in automation. But in this particular case, as we can see, as long as you put the policy in the policies directory, then it will get automatically added, and that means you will be able to actually choose that when you scan an application. The next one I want to show you is scripts. So I've already talked about scripts, and scripts have their own directory here. And obviously you can actually create scripts, you can and you can edit them. And that's one of the key things. So a lot of things like the community scripts add-on include a load of scripts, but rather than actually have them, one thing we wanted with scripts is to make sure you could actually edit them, and so that's why they get put again on file store, and that means you can edit them and change them. So if we go here back to our command line and we have a look under scripts, you also got two directories, one called scripts and one called templates, and that actually matches that's exactly the same here because we have scripts and we have templates. And so if we have a look under scripts, then you'll see all of these directories. If you want to change, so if you create scripts, and particularly if you create scripts for authentication, then you will need to actually add them you'll need to put them in the right place, and you'll need to add them to ZAP. Now, the one thing, by default, we don't actually load all of the scripts under these directories. And that's because we don't, we probably could make a good guess, but for some of them, things like JavaScript, we've actually got different JavaScript engines now. So it's not always that easy for ZAP to understand how it should add particular scripts. And if I go back to the frequently asked questions, we do actually have a question about how do you add a script to ZAP from the command line. And you can see here that, again, you can use configuration items. So this information, so the information about the scripts is held in the config.xml file, but the actual scripts are held on the directory. So you can see that the file name there, you typically have to use, it's always best to use the full path. So you do need to add this configuration information to ZAP. You can do that via the API as well, but here, as you can see, you can do it via the configuration file, and you need to make sure that the script is available to ZAP. So if you're running in Docker or another container, you need to make sure that that container can access that particular script. So that's scripts, and that's kind of the reason why I said we don't load them by default, because we can't always tell whether we've got enough information, which is it's a bit of a pain, but that's a very practical thing. So one of the other things I do want to point out is if you actually come here and have a look at plugins, so this is all of the ZAP add-ons that I've got installed, and these add-ons, so these will override any of the ones. So this is typically when you actually do a check for updates, and so by default, ZAP will include a set of add-ons. So things like the active scan rules, they're included by ZAP by default, but I think they'll stay in the installation directory unless you do a check for updates and download the latest version. So if you download the latest version of any add-on, then this is the directory they'll get put in. And while I'm here, I will actually point out these log4j files. So these are actually how you configure ZAP logging. And the one we use now is log4j2. So if you have a problem and we ask you to actually change the logging level, which you might do, then this is the file you actually want to change. And it's kind of standard log4j logging. So basically what I've done is I've explained how you can set configuration items from the ZAP command line, both using the -config option and the -config file option, and shown you the config.xml file, which is where these kind of configuration items are stored, and told you about all the other files that ZAP uses. Now, what I'll do, because we have been kind of delving to the source code a bit, I will mention that if you have a look at something, we talk about the passive scanners. So what I've done is gone to ZAP proxy, the source code on GitHub, and we're in ZAP source main Java org ZAP proxy ZAP extension pscan. So this is the passive scanner params. So these are the ones that actually can map to those keys we saw before. So if we go and have a look at pscans scan only in scope, you'll see pscans, and hopefully there'll be a scan only in scope. So wherever you see the files, they'll usually end in param. Those are the files that actually implement this functionality, and they will extend this kind of abstract param. So if you do want to have a look at the source code, or if you want to say create a new ZAP add-on and you want to be able to store information in the standard location, then all you need to do is create one of these things, and you define your own keys, and it's pretty straightforward that you need to parse them, but there are various helper methods for that. Standard things. So a lot of the work is done for you. You just kind of need to go create getters and setters. So it's pretty easy to, if you're creating an add-on and you want to add more things to the ZAP config.xml file, and this will work both in ZAP proxy, and actually just go and have a look in ZAP extensions. Have a look at something like the Ajax spider, which happens to be called Spider Ajax for historical reasons. And then we'll go into the source code, and hopefully somewhere we'll see Ajax spider param. And again, we'll see, so Ajax spider is the key, and then we'll have all these things like number of browsers. So And here we go. So there's a number of browsers. So it is pretty easy to find the relevant things in the source code as well if you want. You can just search for those keys. And then you can see, you can tie everything together to see, and then you can actually go back, and if you've got the ZAP source code in your IDE, you can actually see where these things are being used and where they end up. So that is, yeah, that's pretty much everything I was going to go through. If anyone who's listening got any questions?
Simon, I had a question about the SQLI only policy that we saw. Was that specific for Juice Shop, or does that is that included default as part of ZAP?
No, so that's one that I just created. So what will happen is you will only, for a fresh ZAP install, you will only get its default policy. So the SQLI one was just one I happened to create for testing purposes, for playing around. And if we have a look in, it might have actually been for one of these sessions, I can't remember, but you can see, or it might not. So you can see here, I've just enabled it for Hypersonic SQL and MS SQL. So basically, you will only get the default policy, but you can create as many as you like. And if someone else creates one and you drop them into that folder, then when you restart ZAP, then it'll appear here.
All right, that makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, in which case I think that's it for this session. Next time, I think hopefully I'll go for make a start on ZAP automation. Thank you, and until then.